With economic inequalities rising throughout the US and Canada, many people have gained consciousness of their condition and have started to give up their support of current neoliberal capitalism. There is a small minority of libertarians in favor of freer, non-interventionist capitalism, and more in favor of ideas pushed by politicians such as Bernie Sanders. This includes a Green New Deal, welfare reform, and universal healthcare. Right-wing reactionaries might oppose this by calling it socialism, but it really is much closer to steps toward social democracy, like the pre-Reagan era of Keynesian economics that saw the development of a strong middle class. Some even advocate for the Nordic model as seen in Sweden and Finland, to name a few. This is an analysis of this socio-economic model, social democracy, from a Marxist perspective. First, some history. Social democracy has its roots in the 19th century socialist movement. It advocated for an evolutionary and peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism, using the established liberal democracy opposed to the revolutionary, scientific socialist approach to this transition. In the early post-war era in Western Europe, social democratic parties rejected the Marxist-Leninist model from the Soviet Union, pushing for an alternative path to socialism, or to a compromise between capitalism and socialism. In our days, the first group would be called Democratic Socialists and the second Social Democrats. In the 20th century, Social Democrats embraced a mixed economy with private property, and only a minority of socialized essential utilities and public services. They promoted Keynesian economics while disregarding the idea of replacing capitalism with socialism. Social democracy has strong connections with the labor movement and trade unions, being supportive of worker rights, seeking to, in a way, humanize capitalism. It then evolved to the third way, which aims to merge liberal economics with welfare policies. It was developed in the 1990s and is sometimes associated with the social democratic parties. It also evolved as the Nordic model, applied in countries like Norway, Sweden, and Finland. With the historical context out of the way, let's get into it. First, I believe it is important to further differentiate socialists from social democrats. As socialists, we acknowledge that capitalism is based on a contradiction of class antagonisms that objectively cannot be reconciled, and that the state arises only when and insofar as this is the case. The proof of that being the existence of these antagonisms in the first place. Social democrats seem to believe that a welfare state can solve this issue and reconcile the two classes, bourgeoisie and proletariat. But a social democracy is a mixed capitalist system with strong social safety nets and social programs. So in a way, it's friendlier capitalism. It doesn't do anything to solve class antagonisms. It just alleviates them for a while. In Nordic countries with this model, unionization rates are usually much higher, so workers enjoy better benefits, pay, and working conditions. Being a social democrat means not wanting to overthrow capitalism, but achieving a more regulated, revised capitalism through reform in a liberal democracy. Sure, social democracies have improved material conditions for the working class when compared to free market capitalism. The NHS is a good example of this, though the Tories are slowly dismantling it in the name of keeping a balanced budget. There are still significant problems that remain with social democracies. They do not fix the fundamental flaws of capitalism. First, the mechanisms in capitalist economies have a tendency to generate gross inequalities of income, wealth, and opportunities. Since most of wealth is generational, you can't really redistribute it with income tax. Inheritance tax exists, but it's not a good final solution either. Rich people always find ways to get away with fraud. Now, social democracies have generally failed at addressing these problems. Only a radical change in the mode of distribution of personal incomes, socialism, offers a real chance of eliminating that income inequality. Most of these flaws, such as cyclical instability, alienation, and exploitation, are still present in social democracies. Taxes on the rich and progressive taxation do not attack, I don't like what I just did, the source of the issue, only its effects. Then the idea of a mixed economy is problematic. In those that have existed, the socialistic elements have remained subordinated to the capitalist elements, like the commodity and wage forms that have remained core parts of the production process. The working class also remains subordinated to the bourgeoisie. Class antagonisms don't magically go away with reform. What social democracy is effectively doing is consolidating capitalism as a system and limiting its efficiency. These social safety nets had to be financed out of tax revenue extracted from the private sector, which meant that the opportunities for expansion of welfare measures and the free distribution of basic services have been historically dependent on the health of that private sector. Only when the capitalist sector has been growing strongly have social democratic governments been able to deliver on their promises. In that way, SocDems are extremely limited in what they can achieve. Their own attempts at redistributing threaten to destroy the capitalist extraction of wealth, which they themselves depend on. Finally, social democracies mostly popped up under threat of communist revolution when the USSR became a prominent power. Now that it no longer exists, we see them rolling out austerity measures and slowly dismantling social safety nets for the benefits of capitalists. Social democracies also rely on imperialism and exploitation of the global south to thrive. Even on the most basic goods such as a smartphone, the raw materials were sourced in African mines where the workers might be paid near starvation wages, then sent to China to be assembled in a factory where the workers might be paid another starvation wage. The surplus value produced by that cheap labor is extracted by the company selling it to the customer in the metropolis. This same principle applies to almost every good produced abroad. In short, European social democracy was built on the pillage of the global south. Most of the infrastructure that allows social democracy to function was built on money from active pillaging and is maintained by exploitation of the global south through imperialism and neocolonialism. A good example of this is the time Norway found massive reserves of oil in the 1980s. Beyond the fact that oil extraction and sale alone represent the exploitation of the global south, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which oil revenues funds, owns 1.4% of the world's entire stock market. Many of the firms in this massive portfolio have supply lines which run through developing countries. This includes investments in firms such as Apple, Coca-Cola, and Hershey. Apple contracts labor through Foxconn, who has treated workers so badly that they were committing suicide at work because of the atrocious conditions. It also relies on coltan, which is a mineral heavily linked to warlordism, child abuse, and slavery in the eastern Congo basin. Coca-Cola has brought water sources and then restricted local access in developing countries like the Indian states of Kerala, Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Rajasthan, which cripples the ability of local farmers to produce. Many other companies in this portfolio heavily rely on the exploitation of the global south and give atrocious working conditions to their work. All of these firms directly bring about immense human suffering across the globe. This directly benefits each and every resident of Norway. The fund is worth $195,000 per person, directly off the backs of the workers in the global south. When people argue that social democracy is not inherently imperialistic, their claim can easily be countered by the fact that it is capitalist, and it's inevitable that its extension will be imperialism. Finally, Western social democrats have no coherent idea of what planned and non-commodity form of production for use are ultimately about, and how their problems can be addressed. Rejecting the planning of an economy and the dismantling of capitalism beyond basic social reform is a completely moronic attitude when you consider the previous points. We socialists don't just believe in taxing the rich, we believe in replacing the system that allows them to exist at the expense of everyone else, not mitigating its effects and ignoring the suffering it causes. On an end note, reform can be a good thing on the path to socialism, but it can also be quickly withdrawn, and we have to be careful about it.